Sorry? That's fine. Good evening, everyone. Nina Mani. I would like to acknowledge we are meeting on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains and pay our respects to elders past and present. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship to the land. We acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. And we also extend that respect to other Aboriginal language groups and First Nations, particularly those Indigenous people and others who are joining us online. So welcome to this special event. It's the last Australian Institute of International Affairs event in South Australia for this year. I'll just introduce myself. I'm Leonard Blaseby. I'm the president of the South Australian branch of the AIIA. I'd like to welcome the ambassador of the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany, and also the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Institute for International Affairs, who've been instrumental in making this event come around to us tonight. So I'm just going to give you a few climate change statistics to get the ball rolling as to what we're going to be talking about tonight, and then I'll pass over to Bryce Wakefield, who's the CEO. So 31% is the number that is the growth in solar power generation in the first 3 quarters of 2025 compared to the same period in 2024. Wind power grew by 7.6%. Most of the growth in both of these sectors comes from China, making it a clean energy superpower. This acceleration meant renewables produced more electricity than coal in the first half of the year and kept pace with increases in electricity demand. 109%, the extent to which new solar and wind power outpaced growing energy demand in the first half of 2025, according to the group EMBA. Second or third, that's where 2025 is expected to rank in the hottest years on record. The final average won't be known for a few weeks, but mean near surface temperature between January and August was 1.42% above pre-industrial levels. $152 billion. That's the global average annual property losses from natural disasters in 2025, according to the group Verisk, a data analytics firm. That dovetails with the prediction made in January by Gallagher Ray, an insurance broker, that losses will be around 150 billion per year as the new normal. 252 miles per hour. That was the wind speed that Hurricane Melissa had when it made landfall in Jamaica at the end of October, the strongest ever recorded hurricane. Insured losses alone from the subsequent devastation are estimated at between $2.2 and $4.2 billion. 1.739 meters. The amount of rainfall recorded at a weather station in central Vietnam in a 24-hour period in October, according to the World Meteorological Organization. If this is confirmed, it will be the second highest recorded total ever in a 24-hour period and breaks records for the Northern Hemisphere and Asia. 19, the number of life-threatening heatwave days the average person in the world is now exposed to throughout the year. Most of those in the poorest countries. That just gives you a bit of an idea of some of the positives and a number of the negatives in relation to where we're going in terms of climate change. But that's enough from me, and I will pass over now to Bryce Wakefield, who's the CEO of AIIA. Thank you very much, Bryce.
Thank you, Leonard. It's a pleasure to be here once again at a climate talk organised in conjunction with the Embassy of Germany. We've run one of these in Sydney as well, alongside the French Embassy, actually. And it's a great opportunity to hear from a wide range of perspectives on this crucial issue. As you've just heard, we have presidents and branches of the Australian Institute of International Affairs throughout the country, and anyone can be a member. If you're interested in this sort of discussion, not necessarily just related to climate, but about international affairs in general, I'd encourage you all to go along to AIIA talks and perhaps even become a member of the branch. So I want to thank the German Embassy for partnering with us on this, to thank our very special guest, Ambassador Beata Grischke, and also thank you to my staff, Hebe in particular, for organising today's event. Before we get started, I do want to focus on another initiative, an unrelated, I guess, initiative, but related to the topic initiative that the AIIA is running, which might be of interest to you. We have opened applications for something called the Indo-Pacific Cooperation Network, which is a network of international study tours that travel to Japan, the South Pacific and Australia, and are focused on disaster resilience, including climate resilience. This is a fully funded initiative, and it's aimed at young professionals in the disaster resilience space. So I thought I'd better mention this because this is probably relevant to some of you and some of the people in your networks. So if you'd like to find more about this major initiative that we run, please do jump on our website and take a look. But as I said, in the meantime, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome to the stage and introduce Beata Grischke, who is, again, the ambassador of Germany. She's held a number of posts throughout the world in her time, including, I believe, in The Hague, China, Russia. But of relevance, she was Germany's special envoy to Pacific Island states. So I imagine she has a lot to say on today's topic. Please join us, Beata.
Thank you. So, dear Bryce, dear Leonard Blaseby, dear panelists, and ladies and gentlemen, I also, at the start, would like to acknowledge the Ghana people as the traditional owners of the land we are meeting on today, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And it's my pleasure also to welcome you today to our special Adelaide Climate Talk. It was mentioned before. We organized together with AIIA other climate talks, and I'm glad that we are here, as there is also special relation to Germany in this region of Australia. I just say Barossa Valley and Adelaide Hills, so it's also nice to have that link. We are meeting today to talk about the climate of inequality, marginalist voices on the front lines of climate security. So that's a special topic. And so I think that this event will show our joint effort to foster the discussion on climate change, and also to show that an informed and inclusive debate on the most pressing climate and security challenges of our time is taking place also here in South Australia. Today's discussion takes place at an important moment. And why? Yes, because 25 years have passed since the UN Security Council established the Women, Peace and Security Agenda through Resolution 1325, which recognizes the indispensable role of women in conflict prevention and resolution and the importance of their equal participation in promoting peace and security. And with the climate crisis driving insecurity, displacement, and resource pressures, particularly for women and marginalized groups, promoting an inclusive approach to peace and security is more important than ever. Together here in Australia, and we see how extreme heat, and some numbers were also mentioned before, bushfires, coastal vulnerability intersect with social and economic inequality. And it was also mentioned that I worked a bit in 22, 23 on the Pacific. There I also saw with my own eyes these impacts that are even more pronounced now. And they are raising questions of community resilience and the ability of the states to respond to accelerating climate change. Another point I would like to mention is that indigenous communities are also central to this conversation. They provide deep knowledge and long traditions of environmental stewardship, and that is also vital for solving or attacking today's challenges. And I'm convinced that locally led and inclusive processes generate solutions that reflect lived realities and can foster long-term cooperation. The broad inclusion of women, youth, and indigenous peoples on all levels of policy making and execution enhances credibility to the process and to our work on climate, peace, and security. And the COP negotiations are the key process to address issues like those mentioned before. I'm very well aware, I'm here in Adelaide. COP31 would, after another decision, would have been very a dynamic moment to discuss here. But I just wanted to assure you that I think the compromise found in the end in Belém will also allow Australia to shape events and to shape the process. But I'm very well aware that there's also disappointment here because I'm here since this morning and I heard, we would have wanted also to have the COP here to also push a little bit the agenda also in the region and in Australia. But I think nevertheless, this next COP will also have a strong footprint by Australia and the Pacific. So looking back at the COP and what Germany has also tried to contribute. At COP28, Germany and the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund was launched the Women and Climate Security Initiative. And since then, Germany has contributed 4 million euros to support 22 local women's organizations in addressing climate-related conflicts and injustices in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. And at COP30, Germany announced a further 1.3 million euro to the WPHF to launch the learning hub Climate Connect that should facilitate climate and security peer learning and collaboration among women-led organizations worldwide. In addition to the multilateral engagement I just described, I also want to highlight the bilateral German-Australian cooperation. I would like only to mention one initiative. Together with ActionAid Australia, we are building in Vanuatu, Doris Day's Community Kitchen. It's a women-led initiative that provides a community-run kitchen that doubles as a cyclone-resilient shelter, offering safety, nourishment, and a hub for everyday resilience. It was just also mentioned the connection to disaster prevention, and I think this is also a good example. So today's event, in my view, reaffirms that inclusive, locally led approaches are a proven pathway to resilience and peace. But you're not here to hear from me for many more hours. So I would just say, before diving into the discussion, I would like to express my gratitude to our moderator, Professor Joanne Bellis, and our distinguished panelists for their time and insights. Thank you to Lot 14 for hosting this event, and special thanks to Price Wakefield, Leonard Plaisby, and I apologize, Hebe Redden from AIIA for organizing this important event, and greeting our honorary consul, in addition, Matthew Williams, whom I just see in the audience. Hello, Matt. Thank you for being here and for your wonderful contribution to German-Australian cooperation. Thank you.
Great. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our speakers to the stage. As you've heard, Joanne Wallace is going to be moderating today's session. Joanne is as well as being a professor at the University of Adelaide, is our co-editor of our Australian Journal of International Affairs, and under her and co-editor Tim Legrand's great leadership, that journal has been lifted into the top quartile of international affairs journals globally. Joining her, we have Jennifer Mackay, a professor at the University of South Australia, Salote Takavakatini, who is a former senior Fijian diplomat, and Ambika Vashwanath, who is currently at La Trobe Asia. So give them a round of applause, please.
Thank you, Bryce. I was going to start with introductions, but you saved me a job. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. We've got an amazing panel of women, which is fantastic, all four of us here to talk about this important topic. We're going to just make it quite organic and hopefully loose. Each of the women on the panel tonight has incredible expertise, but also quite different expertise. So we're going to hear from a range of perspectives and experiences. I mean, Jennifer was saying she's just back from COP. So I'm sure she's got some stories that she can tell all of us. So I'm going to put some questions to the panel, and then we'll open it for discussion with the audience. So I'll just ask the question, and then you can jump in, ladies, whoever wants to begin. Just to get us started, because we're thinking here about marginalised voices and the effect of inequality on climate responses and climate preparedness, I just wanted to ask you, how does climate change exacerbate social inequalities? What groups are disproportionately affected? And how does this impact their vulnerability to climate-related disasters?
In Australia or
wherever your expertise takes us.
I might prefer, but oh yes. Excellent, thank you. Well, in Australia, of course, the most vulnerable people are going to be women and homeless women and poor women and Indigenous people in rural areas too. And the National Climate Report just came out just before I went to COP, and that's a very sound document that documents that and makes that very clear. So there are intersectionalities between all of that, of course, as you'd expect. In fact, my son works for the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, compiling Australia's homelessness statistics. So he always tells me the main victims are women who are older women and younger women who find themselves at the hands of domestic violence or other social problems. So in the Pacific, of course, the existential threat is enormous. I took a bunch of students to Fiji on an NCP trip, and we showed them the villages where the people have had to move, and the reactions I got from these students who really some of them hadn't ever been out of Australia. I took 5 of them, no, 20, out of Australia for the first time. The others, some were more travelled, but just to show them that, and the reflections we got from that. So I think there's a lot of, our media is not very good at actually explaining the facts. It's appalling. And it also presents a polemic on it's always the fault of the victim, and it's not. There are systemic long-term problems in Australia which will now be exacerbated by climate change, and in Fiji and other places you've got the same issues but perhaps handled potentially in a more communal way than we would.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I think, as a start, climate change disproportionately affects vulnerable people and nations. And with that, the region that I come from in the Pacific, where the economies rely on climate-sensitive sectors like agriculture, tourism, and for the people of the Pacific, relying mostly on fisheries as well. So, you have a group of people, a region where the people and the nations rely on climate-sensitive sectors for livelihoods, for trade, for their economies, and also to support their political structures. So, it exacerbates these sensitivities because a lot of them then don't have coping mechanisms or are not equipped, either human or financial resources to be able to cope. So we see this link, this nexus, and we see it increase as cyclones become more, it increases in intensity, but also in terms of the scale of the natural disasters that are happening in this region. So I'd say that it harms the most vulnerable, not just people, but nations as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And thank you to AIIA and the German Embassy for putting this together. The one disadvantage of going last is that you have to first say that no, that's all right. I'm happy to say I agree with everything, and we'll go on from there. But I wanted to put forward some numbers when we think about the fact that the most disadvantaged are, of course, by and large women, and that could be women of all ages, children, older folks, but also, as Salote said, poorer folks in countries, but as well as poorer countries, right? So if we wanted to quantify this a little bit, and I'll give an example from the 2015 earthquake in Nepal, which was one of the most devastating earthquakes. It's a region in the Himalayas that experiences earthquakes on a very regular basis. So in Nepal, in northern India, we have earthquakes very often. Now, earthquakes by themselves are a naturally occurring event, right? But when you layer that with development that doesn't respect a naturally occurring event, when you layer that with then construction, for example, or growth in terms of movement of people, livelihoods that don't respect then a naturally occurring event, you see the risks and then the cascading fallouts of that, right? So in 2015, and I'm opening up the geographic field a little bit, and you can blame Bryce for this one because he said Indo-Pacific. So I said, all right, let's bring the Indo side of the Pacific into this discussion. But in 2015, the fallout of that earthquake, we saw, a lot of research has been done after that, is that over 70% of the people affected were women. Now, this might not seem like a very surprising statistics. We do know that women get affected more often than not. But the reasons as to why this happened, I think, is a very important point in to answer your question as to why. And these are very preventable then in that sense, right? One of the reasons why women were the most affected is because they were at home doing various kinds of household work, or they were in their home gardens or in the nearby agricultural fields. And when the earthquake struck, what we found in research after that is that they didn't know what was the most important thing that they thought they should grab before they left their home or a structure that they were in. And so a lot of women were either lost their lives or were injured in the rubble because they didn't have that kind of very basic knowledge, right? Now, the other reason that was found as to why the women were most affected is that they were never given life-saving skills. This is something that we are seeing right now in the flooding that's happening in Sri Lanka, where I just looked at the numbers of the population of Adelaide, and the number of people that have been displaced in Sri Lanka is almost twice the population of the city of Adelaide. So if you can imagine, for those of you who are from this city, trying to move everybody from this city somewhere else, right? And one of the most common reasons why women are then affected in a situation like an earthquake or a flood is that lack of life-saving skills that have never been taught. So in the flood is a lot of younger folks, men, will climb a tree, for example, or they'll climb some sort of structure. Women are never taught how to do that, right? Now, I learned how to climb a tree when I was young, and that's because I have 9 cousin brothers, and so there was no option to be, climbing these trees and playing a sport, but that's not very common in a lot of countries. And so if we drill down as to what the reasons are for these exacerbated inequalities when we see the effects of then a naturally occurring event and the risks that come from that, we realize that a lot of this is quite very much preventable if we think about it as then bringing a gendered lens into how we then respond to events, both climate change, but also then natural events.
Thank you. And you've all mentioned women in your answers. And I was wondering, it was in the year 2000 that UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was passed on women, peace and security. There was a bit of initial optimism, but my sense is that there's been stalled progress and even backsliding on advancing gender equality in recent years. How successfully do you think that the concepts of linking climate action to women, peace and security, and to the gendered aspects of climate disasters and resilience has been internationally, and what would you like to see change?
Okay. What would I like to see change is a lot more money. I feel like that's an easy answer. But I would say focus as to where we are, one, thinking about putting the pool of money that we have before we say, we need more money. Because this is not coming from me, but I'll quote the UNDP rep in Fiji, who said that in most cases, the world hasn't run out of money. There is enough money. It's where we are spending it and where that focus of that spending is, right? And in many cases, and I've seen this both in South Asia, but also in small island states and in the Indian Ocean, and in the little time that I've been spending here in Australia and in the Pacific and doing some field work in the Pacific, is that there's a lot of misdirection of where that money is being focused. It's a lot of how not to do aid in some ways when it comes to answering these questions. Now, there has been some amount of progress, right? If we look at the last decade, you now have 43 countries that have integrated climate into their Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan. Now, we might question whether that integration has gone that step further in terms of implementation. And then we looked, and this is research that's been done. Out of those 43 countries, almost 35 countries have actually taken steps to do that implementation. Now, once 35 countries out of 43 seems like a very big number, but 35 countries out of almost 200 countries in the world is actually a very small number, right? Almost none of these countries have actually a proper framework and a system for gender budgeting. So you might have countries that have said, okay, we will put in, X amount of money for WPS, Women, Peace and Security, in our National Action Plan, and this is our commitment. But has that actually worked? Where is it working? Where is our money making sense? Where is it not making sense? And do we need to rethink? These are not processes that have been integrated into that system. So very often then 5 years later, you will see a country doing some sort of assessment, and then they will say, oh, nothing ever worked. But that's not because it wasn't necessary. It was because it was, in a lot of cases, not being deployed in a way that where you're deploying your, whether it's funds, whether it's resources, people, research, energies, was actually what that region wanted. And I'll put one more statistic over here. We talk a lot about how countries are stepping up. In COP, there was a lot more commitments, for this new forest scheme that's going to be hopefully worked globally. But if we actually look at the numbers from the kind of money that's been spent in the last 3 years alone, only 0.01%, okay, so 0.01%, not even 1% of projects support climate action along with a gender lens. So you have any number of projects that support climate action, and in that you will have projects that are about solar, wind, and then the dollar figure will rise. But if you then merge that with climate action and gender, it comes down to 0.01%.
Australian government has a GEDSI approach to its aid. I did a project in Vietnam on that. So I think Australia but the amount of aid we give is also very small. Nothing like Germany's, for example. So look, I think there are problems even in Australia with equity and diversity on boards and on. So I'll just say that I think there's a long way to go and a diverse board and with more women on it, you're going to get a different result. And a lot of the literature says that women are more inclined to want to maintain a relationship rather than be competitive. Having said that, I've got lots of great male colleagues, but so I think you're exactly right. We have a very strong GEDSI framework, but a lot of how it gets implementation is always the problem with the law. You can have the best laws in the world, but if they're not implemented, that's it.
Yeah, thank you. Just in support of what Ambika and my colleagues have already mentioned, I think in terms of the UN commitments and the big global commitments, in terms of that being converted to policies at the state levels, that has progressed very well. And we see that coming out a lot, in national action plans. In Fiji, for example, that's actually been domesticated. And, the WPS, Australia's funding a lot of the women's economic empowerment programs as well. So there's actually a 2025 National Action Plan on women's economic empowerment. Also, the Fiji's National Action Plan 2023 to 2028. So a lot of these global commitments have been translated to national policies. I think the gap is always the implementation, and sometimes a lot of this is about the how. Is how do we implement this at the local level? So it's about ownership. It's about the inclusion of the state apparatus, the local communities, the women that are impacted in designing some of these programs and the activities that are relevant to actually implementing or rolling out these initiatives. And a lot of the times this is lacking because a lot of these conversations are only happening within confined spaces at the strategic and official levels. It's happening between donors themselves and not necessarily where, donors are sitting with donor recipients and there is, an exchange and there's, a lot more work going into that. So ownership is often lacking in a lot of these, initiatives that have great intentions, but do not actually go the extra mile to understand the context, understand the culture, particularly in countries in a region like the Pacific where there is, the knowledge systems of how things work in the communities, in the cities, in the urban areas, in the rural villages as well. It's a big difference. So a lot of these things actually stop. They do very well at the international levels. They come into state, domesticated policies and laws, but it's where the rubber meets the road, the implementation, and when it actually has to be delivered to the people, this is where the gaps are often found. And I think this is where funding, monitoring, training, and basically in inclusion in terms of designs and programs needs to happen more. Thank you.
Just to add on here, right, to what Salote is saying, it's the design, it's at the design stage that often these programs are quite fundamentally have all the missteps. I don't want to say they're wrong, but they are fundamentally missing something at that design stage, because very often these programs are designed by people sitting very far away from where these events are actually occurring. And I'll give an example of a project that we worked on in India to look at monitoring stations along a river basin in India, and they wanted to, the funders wanted to look at how monitoring stations, evaluation, training at all of these stations can be more gender responsive, right? And they had a set of questionnaires that a questionnaire that they wanted us to work on with the technical experts. Those questions had no contextual understanding of where these stations were in these very small towns in fairly remote parts of India. So we changed the entire questionnaire. Then, of course, we had months of back and forth with the funders saying, these are the questions that are going to get you the answers. But when you have at that design stage itself folks who don't necessarily, as Salori said, understand cultural context, then you're going to have a whole cascading results that are not really effective. And then 2 years later, somebody will say, oh, that money was not well spent.
Thank you. I think we'll stay in the Pacific with just building on Salote's comment. And in the Pacific, climate change has very explicitly been securitized. You would have heard, Ambassador, in the 2018 Boy Declaration on Regional Security by the Pacific Islands Forum, adopted by Pacific Islands Forum leaders, that they recognise that climate change is the, and I quote here, single greatest threat to the livelihood, security and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific. Now, how useful is it to frame climate change as a security issue? And what are the potential risks of this securitised approach? Maybe Salote, you could start, because I can see your face. You've got something to say.
So, thank you. Yeah, a really important question. I think looking back, and when I think back, climate change has always been a security issue in the Pacific and in Pacific communities. Our worldviews, our ways of knowing, our ways of doing, our perception of the world and the environment that we live in and the world around us is non-linear. So everything it's related. Everything around us, everything is spiritual, everything is holistic, and so you cannot think of your livelihood or your fishing boundaries or the conservation efforts that the village has put in place as disconnected from your own security, not just human security, but food security, health security, and so forth. So the issue, I think, is not whether climate change is framed as a security issue, but that being weaponized against us. I think that's really the issue. How people are defining security for us. So many times when we're talking about climate change and security, it's an existential crisis for us. It actually means whether we survive as a people, as a region, or not. And so you can't really separate it. It's a security issue, but in all its forms and holistically. Not just traditional security, that's one of it, that's an aspect of it, but it means how a person is secure in their own home, in their own environment, in their own village. And there are different threats that they face. Along the coastal area, it'll be sea level rise, it'll be the loss of village boundaries, loss of their own islands or atolls. But for people in the interior, they're also facing the weather patterns impacting the agricultural seasonal produce. Not only that, it's also the landslides that are happening. So it's in different forms, but they're all talking about whether a person is safe and secure within their own environment. So I think it's always been a security issue. It's just been politicized and it's just been weaponized and used against the Pacific. So I think that's where my comments lie.
I totally agree with that. But the interesting thing politically that came out of the ITLOS decision and the ICJ decision was that even if the country's maritime boundaries change because of sea level rise, the whatever's left will still be considered to be the land. Well, mind you, there might not be. Yes, so that is, I think that is fantastic, and so that. But of course, you will have all of the problems of the people who have to move out and move to another place within their own. You've got that, yes. But that, I think, is really stretching the UNCLOS. But nobody's taken much issue with it. But it's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. An important question, right, as to how we think of security, and I think, and I know, knowing Salode a little bit, when you say climate security to the two of us, we're going to think human security, environment, food, water, gender. But I also know for a lot of other folks, you say climate and security, they're going to think, boats and guns and bombs, right? And so why do we have to bring a climate lens into quote unquote traditional security? And I mean, I'm not from the Pacific, I'm from India. I think I've already mentioned that a couple of times. And so I don't want to speak obviously on the region that I know very little about, but to put a slightly broader framing on this important question is that even if we were to think about climate and security from a more traditional perspective of what security means, which is a framing that I think really we need to do away with now, because the lines between what is traditional security and non-traditional security have completely blurred. But for the uniforms and the militaries and all of that, it's still an incredibly important issue, right? In the Pacific alone, if you look at the number of natural events that are leading to then disasters, and the response that is generally from a military, whether it is the Australian disaster relief forces or New Zealand or other countries around the region, to an extent from India as well, that works then with partners in this region to provide relief. All of these are affecting their militaries, their maritime security, their boats and their submarines. And I don't want to say more about that because, Joanne is really the expert on these things. And I feel like you should answer your own question a little bit. But it's something that they have to increasingly think about. How do we combat, if we are helping out with, XYZ disaster relief effort, additional disasters that might be occurring, rising heat, bad actors in that space, the lack of water, the lack of food, right? So all of these are very integrated, compounded effects. So we cannot think of climate and security, whether it's traditional or non-traditional, in a siloed space anymore. That's, whether it's the Pacific or the Indian Ocean or a broader global scale.
It's interesting. No, I won't answer my own question, but I was going to say I do a lot of work with defence, and defence really understands climate change. I mean, just for one of the pragmatic reasons is a lot of the defence estate around Australia is what burns in bushfire season, but they're also very conscious that they're increasingly going to be needed to respond to climate crises. It's just that gap at the political level, unfortunately, that is the block that really gets in the way. But I wanted to pick up on something that an example that Jennifer gave, and of the settling with the maritime boundaries. And it was really the Pacific Islands that have led the way on that legal development in many ways.
I met the student who actually went to The Hague when I was in Belém, Abdul. He was fantastic. And, he didn't argue that. He argued lots of other things, and of course got the Vanuatu president on board and got all the submissions and got all the NGOs. That was an initiative in the ITLOS decision, and the judges, they came up with that. It sort of disincentivizes bad behaviour, I think, in a good way.
Well, it was also the Pacific Islands Forum that made the declaration on settling their maritime boundaries a couple of years ago that has helped to feed that legal precedent, but helped to set at least customary international law. I'm a former lawyer too, but
that's tricky.
But that's an example of what we would traditionally think of as marginalised voices from the Pacific. We might argue whether the Pacific is really marginalised. I think they're incredibly powerful in their own way, but I think it'd be great to have a positive note, because we've been, you can get a bit. The real risk with climate change, I find, is it lapsing into fatalism and it all becoming too hard. But it's not. It can't be. We need to survive. So if we think about a positive story, you know, the settling the maritime boundaries, declaring the maritime boundaries is one example. Can you think of any other positive examples where marginalised voices have initiated and achieved change for the good in the climate space?
Well,
I mean, did you...
The COSIS people, which were the Commission of Small Island States, who I also met in Belém, who are a predecessor of the Pacific students, brought the ITLOS decision, which said basically that land-based greenhouse gas emissions are affecting the ocean, therefore it's everybody's responsibility. But the other positive story is the acceptance of the science. But a couple of cases here in Australia had already done that, Sharma and Pabai. We didn't get a good result in either case, but the science was not argued. We didn't get a good result because we don't have a duty on the minister to consider. We don't have a climate trigger in Australia. We still don't have one, even after the last amendments, we don't have one. So that's why they were bad decisions for that reason. But the science was completely accepted, and the ICJ advisory opinion did the same. So that's a really good decision. You don't have to line up 5 experts on each side and argue it all out using the rules of evidence, which are dreadful, really. So IPC science acceptance is a very positive aspect.
I think if you look at the Pacific voice in, the mobilization against climate change, this has really, even at the global level, just the platform that it's provided Pacific leaders who've taken a lead on, if you look at the population size, you look at the region, you look at how vulnerable they are, we're always talking about the vulnerability of these small island states. But looking at what they've done globally in pushing the conversation, in creating the awareness, not just internationally, but even in our own communities, where not just tangible assets, at risk, but also intangible cultural, knowledge systems, assets, language are also increasingly at risk. And so I think one of the big pluses for having this amplified One Pacific voice on climate change has really pushed our own people in our own region to safeguard and to hark back into history and bring back some of the practices, revive some of the things that have, really been misplaced, displaced because of the, education systems that we now have. So we're also looking into, and not only that, it's also coming into national conversations where traditional knowledge systems and ways of doing are really now part of the national conversations into disaster resilience work, recovery, and a lot of this really informs what our countries are doing. And it's also just the whole inclusivity of traditional knowledge and systems. I think that's an incredible win. And if not for the Pacific voice being very loud, being very clear as well about what needs to be done, what the realities are, and because they're seeing it every day, so they know we are going to live with this. Let's look back at how we used to do this. The solutions are within our own communities. And so that's really been, I think, a positive outcomes of some of the climate change conversations that have been happening. Thank you.
And I'll just add one more example. I have a whole lot of examples of positive change from all my research in different parts. But to add on here, I think the fact that we are now seeing food security as a much more nuanced, concentrated discussion at a global scale is, again, I would say, thanks to voices from the Pacific pushing on this. Even just 5-6 years ago, if you went to these, big security kind of conferences, whether it's Shangri-La in Singapore or the Munich Security Conference in Germany or others around the world, which are very, very traditional securitized kinds of conferences, you would not have major sessions on food security, for example. And now you do. And I think that is a very important shift also. As you said, right, a lot of defense forces around the world are thinking about climate change. But how do we think about it in a much more nuanced fashion? That shift we are seeing now in the last few years. And I would say food security, the attention, the research, the push for more collaboration, and now the push to, fill this huge gap that USAID is going to leave behind with the pulling out of its funding, but a lot of countries are stepping up, I think is a very important indication of how some of this conversation is changing for a much more positive way in that sense. Yeah.
The cooperation also mandating the Plastics Treaty fell over, but the High Seas Treaty has these now huge areas of the ocean which are designated as, I can't remember the name of them, but the countries that want to exploit them have to use, and I saw somebody in Berlin who explained all this to me, the scientific way of actually recording what's down there. Some of it is because it's nodules, but they have to record everything and put it in a public register. So we're moving towards much more collaboration, and we've had that in Australia too, as well, domestically. And that sort of the duty to cooperate is in international law and has been for but it seems to be getting some moment in the face of the shared problem. I think this is the first. The Montreal Protocol was the CFCs, and that was a shared problem too. And it seems as though there'll be always a proportion of the population who won't believe it, but if the better information that the community have, and our media needs to be better, it will encourage. See, I'm a great believer in education. If you give people the facts, they will see the logic. At the moment, the facts are very hard to get in Australia.
Okay, well, I've had my turn. It's now yours. So we'll open the floor for questions. I'll make my way around with the mic. I think that might be the easiest way for people to hear. Oh, she can do it?
Yeah. Got a mic?
So Bryce is just saying, people online, you can put your questions in the message chat box.
Yeah, thank you. I'm David Ness from University of South Australia, and I'm also the co-founder of the World Sufficiency Lab in Paris. So which is very much to do with fairness. And I'm really pleased that the International Court of Justice decision has been raised. And I think the panel's been talking about, the adaptation side mostly. I would like to raise about the fairness of the relationship between Australia and the Pacific Islands in terms of Australia's producing so much emissions, and Australia argues, we've got a target of 62 to 70%, but from where I sit, that's not enough, because it's just to do with all renewable energy, and it overlooks all the overconsumption of resources by Australia, which greatly impacts the Pacific Islands. So I wondered if the panel could comment on that. Thank
you. The Scope 3 emissions are still not counted. So that's 62 to 72 by 2035. Yeah. And we have a Climate Change Act, which was passed in 2022, but they haven't yet amended it for this new, which is worrisome. Well, the Climate Change Act itself is very short, but it does put in the target. So the two factors there, Scope 3 are still not included in by our law or by, it seems to be, they try to push it under the carpet. Other countries are pointing that out to us. Mm-hmm.
There's no lack of countries pointing that out to Australia, but I think climate change is really, it's a political issue. And, the sciences are there. The evidence is there, but it requires governments to be serious about what needs to be done, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that regulate the industries, they're the ones that make the laws, they're the ones that determine our, our own contributions, and all this. So we are, I think it's a political issue. And so the response also needs to be political.
I was just going to say, I've just finished a book, and a large part of the book we write about this, because it's not only taking domestic climate action, it's also loss and damage and reparations to the Pacific. And, we've pledged 50 million Australian to the Loss and Damage Fund, which is just a drop. I mean, it's a lot of money to you and I, but it's a drop in the ocean to the size of the challenge. And it really will come down to a question about whether Australians are willing to put their hands in their pockets to the extent that they would need to truly compensate Pacific Island countries for the loss and damage that they are and will suffer. And, you just need to look at the political climate now to have not much confidence that will occur. It's good that it's on the agenda, and I can't blame, this comes back to that securitisation issue. You can't blame Pacific Island countries if they do press the strategic competition button to put some pressure on us for that. But it'll be interesting to see if the momentum internationally goes towards significant loss and damage funding, whether Australia will really kick in a meaningful way. And I guess it's a wait and see. Who's anyone else?
Hi, I'm Sean. I'm a student at the University of Adelaide. Do you guys think that the stance of the Australian government is very hard because the changing of Labor and Liberal governments, and they have very different climate initiatives, especially now with the Liberal government and the Nationals? Do you think that is the main reason why we don't give the Indo-Pacific so much money?
The Labor government.
Yeah, I'm saying that the two different governments is that the stance we have is so broad, and so it can keep moving so much, is why we haven't given a proper stance and to give them more money.
I mean, we're not bad at funding climate adaptation in the Pacific, actually. I mean, it was the Morrison government that I turned up in. I mean, the Tuvalu Forum meeting was memorable for many reasons. If you know the Pacific, you'll understand why. But one of the few positives that came out of that 2019 Pacific Islands Forum meeting was that Australia did announce, I think it was 300 million, was it, Solitaire, I think 500. Yeah, $500 million for climate adaptation in the Pacific. So we're not bad at that kind of spending. But, of course, the far bigger spending is the loss and damage and the reparations. And then, of course, the far bigger cost is, perceived cost by certain groups is domestic climate action.
And I think it's a global challenge. It's not just Australia. We see the flip-flop in the US as well. And economic development is necessary. It's vital as well. But how do we balance that with, and how do we do that without harming the environment? And the harm, we'd say, in the Pacific is not only in the Pacific, it's also happening here in Australia. I was in Canberra during the bushfires in 2020, and catastrophic. It was really scary for someone from the Pacific to come in and see smoke, black smoke billowing in the sky. But it's something that will catch up with everyone. But it is, for now, looking at how do we balance, the environmental policies that are there. And so it really requires a lot of cooperation, international cooperation, and strong political will. And so, it's a tough one.
Thanks, Hebe. Australia and Australia's sort of stance and the political difficulty of discussing climate in Australia has been mentioned quite a bit. I'm wondering if there's ways in which marginalised voices of the region can be brought into the Australian debate. There are mechanisms by which that can happen, and I'm wondering if you have any or more, be brought in more. And I wonder if you have any suggestions for that. one of the things that struck me on this project that I mentioned at the beginning of the session was the difference, I think, between the approach that New Zealand takes to discussing climate in the Pacific and Australia. So the New Zealanders, we traveled both to Fiji and New Zealand as part of this project, and the New Zealanders take the approach that it's not a question of New Zealand helping out their Pacific Island brothers and sisters, if you like. It's also an opportunity to share knowledge and expertise about adverse weather effects that are going to impact New Zealand as well. And you can see the recent floods in Auckland and elsewhere. And there's a lot of knowledge in Fiji that the New Zealanders can take advantage of. And that kind of elevates, I think, the discussion of how Pacific security and Pacific climate security is not simply seen as a matter for them over there and we're helping them out. Are there methods like that that Australia can adopt to kind of center those voices in the Pacific and elsewhere in Australia so as to advance the climate debate?
I think, very good question, Bryce. I think Australians need to take more ownership of their own initiatives in country that they can share with the Pacific. You often see a lot of Australian programs, Australian-funded programs in the Pacific that are not Australian-driven. They like to, I think, contract out their support and their funding. And many times this is, the intention is, it's good intentions, but it's often misplaced because then we are not able to hear and experience Australia's own, for example, their own renewable transitions, their own transitions that are happening here, and a lot of the STEM innovation and development that's happening in Australia that the Pacific can learn from. And as someone who's worked in the Pacific, in government and also in the intergovernmental organizations, we see a lot of that. There's a lot of Australian funding, but it is not owned, if you know what I mean, by Australians. They're not coming in. They don't. I think it's really to do with how they do not want to be perceived in the Pacific, and that needs to change because there's a lot that Australia can share. There's a lot that they can teach as well. You also have your own Indigenous community here in Australia who have a lot of knowledge that can also be transferred to the Pacific. And we hope that we see more of that authentic Australian, not just money, but real human resourcing and intellect and innovation. And I know that in 2019, when we had, when I was with government, we had the guest of government visit to Australia. We went to see a lot of the renewable energy transitions that was happening within the private sector, and they were incredible. And taking things like dirt and dust and rubbish and converting these, this is incredible for countries in the Pacific who have a lot of waste management problems. And so there's a lot that Australia can teach and train and share, but I think they need to, own their funding a bit more.
That's an excellent point. I work with Anne Polina quite a bit, and she would say the same. Yes, and the knowledge is there, and certain key actors can get it out. But I think, yes, I've noticed that it's very important for us to empower our own people and work together.
Yeah. Reluctance that I've always seen, and it's not just in the development space, but it's also in the official spaces in government as well. So I think we need to talk to each other a lot more. Don't stop sending us contractors. Send us the Australians, send us your people. Yeah.
Send real people with experience.
I just want to add, as someone who's been observing some of these things in Australia and in the Pacific, that reluctance that you're saying, I also would have agree with that, and a lot of that is also on the research side of things, right? I have noticed a tendency for researchers, university centers in Australia to want to, obviously partner within Australia, but then partner with what they would say, quote unquote, are like-minded partners globally, but not necessarily with their immediate neighborhood. And I find that a bit odd, because from the little bit that I have traveled around the Pacific, there's some fantastic knowledge there. And I think some of that cross-learning is incredibly useful in many ways. And so it comes back to that question that you asked on fairness as well, right? That hesitancy, one can get it. We see it in South Asia, right? For us, the Brits have that hesitancy a little bit in how they interact. But how do we get beyond that? I think it's okay to come up, with the resources, but also with the human resources to say, I have this knowledge in a respectful manner. You have some other knowledge. How do we bring these two things together? But the one way I feel like for Australia to perhaps get over this hesitancy is to own that they do have that capacity. There is this, very Australian way of being like, we don't want to advertise ourselves a little bit. And I get that, but it's all right to be like, yes, I do have this capacity. I do have this ability that might help you out. And I'll put aside my very Australian way of, being a little bit like self-deprecating. That's not always useful. I get that in a humor setting, but in a real world setting, that's not always very useful when it hinders real collaboration on some levels.
I think you can explain part of that tendency, though, by our history. We're very reluctant to be seen as neo-colonial or overly assertive in the region. So I think that goes to that broader issue. And coming back to your question, Bryce, I think I don't think there's an inherent sympathy in Australia for the Pacific. So I realise that's quite a controversial, but I think that there's a lot of ignorance about the Pacific. There's a sense that there's some nice beaches and resorts in Vanuatu and Fiji. People might have a sense maybe of Kokoda and the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, but very shallow understanding beyond that. So I don't think bringing more Pacific voices here to talk about the Pacific will initiate great change. I think it needs to be much broader structural re-education of the Australian community about our links to the Pacific, about our history as a colonial power in Papua New Guinea and Nauru, about our long links of our corporations and other Australian actors and missionaries across the Pacific. I think if Australians understood better the depth and the length of our links, that then would initiate greater empathy for the Pacific, and that's when the Pacific voices would be able to have the most impact. But yeah, I think at the moment it's, they're over there. There's, we hear that, but I think was it Michael McCormack when he was minister? He was asked. Salote was probably in the Fijian High Com at the time. Where is Salote? Sorry if I'm bringing it back a painful memory, but when he was asked about demands Pacific leaders had made for Australian climate action and funding, and he said, "Oh, they'll be okay. They'll just come over here and pick our fruit. They're always asking for our money." And remember, Melissa Price, when she was in our environment minister, allegedly, reportedly, I hesitate to say for the recording, allegedly told Anote Tong in that Canberra restaurant, for the Pacific, it's all about money. Look, I've got my checkbook here. What do you want? And I think, unfortunately, those alleged comments for any litigation, those alleged reported comments do crystallise thinking of a lot of Australians about the Pacific. Oh, they just want our money. But I think if people had a greater understanding of the history, they would understand much more our obligations and our responsibilities in the Pacific, and also how much we have extracted from the Pacific that has made us wealthy. But that's a much broader process than just the climate stories. Watch out for a book coming out next year by me called Being a Better Neighbour. I just submitted it to the publisher.
And so that's civics and education, and also about our own issues with our own Indigenous people in the past. That's been very much a hidden history. I don't know about you, but I'm mad about what I was taught at school as to compared to what I now know about repression and Indigenous. Well, that was media, yes, and that was relying on all of this ignorance of not you people in the room, but, you know, you've got to tell 10 people that some facts about things.
Now there was...
Thank you. So there were some mentions of defence getting involved after disasters to help out, which is great, I imagine, but that also seems quite contradictory with how polluting defence can be. How do you see defence and like traditional security being shaped by the climate crisis into the future?
There are legal problems with defence being involved in civil, and they get invited in. It's a very complicated process. So whilst we use them, it is a very complicated process. The pollution of PFAS was a mistake of science and lack of understanding. It's not going to happen again, and I think defence now is very, very good at working out the environmental impact of what they do. But everybody used PFAS, including civilian firefighters, and that's why we've got all those problems. So I would say I wouldn't blame defence anymore. They were a victim, like everybody else, of the lack of knowledge and perhaps the suppression of PFAS. I haven't followed that story too much.
I can just answer that a little bit. Traditionally, if you look at disaster relief forces around the world, they are made up of a mix of different branches of your military, defense, and then civilian forces. So perhaps, you know, the Coast Guard in some places. I know Australia doesn't have a Coast Guard, which I find very odd, but it could be the police, for example, or the firefighters, right? And then you will have traditional military forces and then defense forces as well. So in most countries around the world, it is a mix of these that will then be deployed to react to any kind of natural event that has occurred, you know, whether it's a flood, earthquake, cyclone, whatever it might be, whether that's in the country or elsewhere. So the responsibility then of your defense and your military establishment is quite considerable. In many cases, they are there just to help for, you know, the immediate effects, and then they will exit. In some cases, they stay on then as forces that will then help in a long-term setting, right? So, for example, just to go back to the flooding post the cyclone in Sri Lanka at this moment, you have Australian defense forces who are there working with the Indian defense forces and then others from around the region in a lot of post-facto disaster management. So where, you know, the tent cities have been set up and these forces are working together. So they are also in many ways vulnerable to any cascading risk that might happen, you know, a secondary cyclone, rising instances of the lack of water, for example, in these situations, health issues that might come up, any disease that might be spreading, because it is a very serious like flood situation, right? So you have, so they are also at risk along with the population of that country. So there's a number of things that one has to think about in these situations, and how you then safeguard your own people while they are helping some other country if they are deployed elsewhere. And a very interesting thing that I think a lot of folks who don't work on this don't realize is that some of the most amount of resources and in terms of financial resources that have been spent on researching how climate and security, defense and military can actually, you know, do a better job. And you're absolutely right, right? Some of the militaries in the world emit and more than, you know, the bottom 50 countries of the world, if we look at the emission numbers. But the one organization globally that spends the most to figure out how to make this better is NATO. Right? They have a whole system that looks at this, a whole college of experts that look at this. And while they're spending a lot of money on building their arsenal for a number of different reasons, and we can debate that, they're also spending a lot of money on looking at how climate change intersects with the arsenal that they will then deploy, you know, going forward.
Thank you. My thanks to the panel. My name is Michael. I'm a member of the Institute, and I just want to build on the question from Bryce. I'm interested to hear your views on the effectiveness of mechanisms in the multilateral system to elevate voices of vulnerable and marginalised groups in these multilateral discussions, such as COP30 and previous COPs. And given that Australia pushed hard to host COP31 in partnership with Pacific Islands, and now that Australia will, I guess, hold the pen for COP31 negotiations in Turkey, it would have an obligation to enable these marginalised and vulnerable voices to be heard in the next round of negotiations. Thank you.
COP, Bowen reached that sort of quasi-leadership role, and apparently the next, the mid-meeting will be in Fiji. So what was the nature of your question?
On the effectiveness of mechanisms to bring vulnerable voices into the discussion?
Well, at COP, there were lots of vulnerable voices. I think what is missing is further action. The ICJ advisory opinion was before COP, and did I say this already? I said it perhaps in another meeting I was in today, but I went to the legal days and that's all we talked about. I went to the non-legal days and hardly anybody mentioned the ICJ advisory opinion except the president of Vanuatu. And in there they had 3-minute sort of therapy sessions, they called them, and he mentioned it. So I'm still not sure if I've got, I think the vulnerable, there were people from Central America, from lots of Brazilians, in fact a whole bunch of them broke into the COP, and that caused the Brazilian government to bring in the army, but they weren't violent, but they did get in. I think the ICJ case has opinion has certainly heard the vulnerable voices. It was in July. We had COP in November, and as I said, it was partially there. Next year, it'll be much more throughout. I think a lot of people, non-lawyers, find it really hard to understand what it means. So I think the vulnerable, and they were there in force, and it was marvellous to see, and there were wonderful presentations the whole way through. I think it's not to say that everybody has to keep going, nobody should relax, but I think for the future, I think there's, once the ICJ advisory opinion is more integrated into normal thinking and explained in a way that non-lawyers can understand it, it'll be better.
I think there are a lot of opportunities for marginalized voices to access multilateral forums, but I think the issue is always at the national level, what national consultation and what opportunities exist at the national levels for their own marginalized groups and voices to really be heard. Many times this does not happen well or enough. And in places like the Pacific, the church have a big role, and they play, an important role in amplifying and in kind of gathering and in providing those opportunities for people to really come in and talk, and so really mobilize, they mobilize well. But many times it's often a case of the competing priorities. And when you understand the schedules of national governments in the Pacific, the challenges with human and financial resources, time is always just so difficult to pin down, and also getting the right people in the room. Half the time you go into the Pacific, and this is also a development issue, is that a lot of important people are not at their desks doing their work. And so they're not really able to listen to the marginalized voices or to move those, organize those important national consultations that must happen at the national levels, to be able to make its way into the multilateral forum. So many times it's opportunities that need to happen at the national levels. And Australia fund a lot of programs in the CSOs in the Pacific as well. Many times they're often able to go to Geneva for the civil society reporting as well, particularly in human rights conventions. So, all these opportunities are there. But I think many times it's really competing priorities that it becomes very challenging for countries, smaller countries, to really mobilize national consultations and all that. And whilst there's funding for CSO, a lot of times there's also a lack of focus on real issues. Thinking back to all the climate change discussions that we're going to have this week, and looking at the gender dynamics as well, and looking at domestic violence, for example. Now, climate change is not a direct cause, but, what are the direct causes that actually contribute to the increase in domestic violence? And those come down to things like our economic situation, and what are countries doing. So many times when there's too many competing priorities, when there's too many issues happening, countries are not able to really focus on what needs to be done first to really address, because those are the root causes, those are the root problems. And many times it just convolutes the conversation. There's too many voices, there's too many issues, and then it just gets left by the wayside. So a lot of it is really competing priorities.
And criminalising protest actions is rife, including in New South Wales and South Australia. You remember that incident, where one incident and we got the most draconian laws within, I think, half an hour without consultation of the Law Society, which is the norm with legislation. So criminalising environmental activists who are often, you criminalise Indigenous, it's a general criminalising has gone on rampantly in many countries. That's a problem.
I'm going to give a slightly different answer, and I don't think in today's day and age these large multilateral formats are actually as useful as they perhaps once were. I'm a big fan of smaller minilateral formats, trilaterals, 4 or 5 countries coming together. You can have much better focus. In some ways, you can be faster, you can be a little more nimble in going from that design to that implementation to that rollback, feedback, feed loop stage. It's also easier to get more voices than to be able to convey what needs to be conveyed in a much more systematic fashion. Not to say that we need to dismantle the UN or any of these agencies. They are there, but they cannot be the only space. They are very ineffective in some ways, right? And I'll give you example. You have your major agencies sitting in countries where it is impossible for most people around the world who might be considered marginalized for some reason or the other to get a visa to go represent themselves, right? It's as simple as that. We had a couple of years ago big UN water conference in New York where we got funding. I was part of a consortium of organizations. We got the money from the Dutch. We got money from several other European nations to have a number of side events. They were all going to be talking about, different kinds of vulnerability groups and water, women, men also looking at, the vulnerability side on the men and the effects of that. I couldn't bring so many people to speak at this conference simply because it came down to visa and then costs, right? Now, you might get funding to bring the voices from wherever in the world, but it's not just about bringing somebody there. You cannot just put somebody for show and to say, yes, I had one voice from, Africa or the Pacific or South Asia or Asia, right, to represent an entire continent. So I think we need to have a mix of these kinds of systems where the larger multilateral institutions might serve their purpose for a certain number of things, but we need to remove some of the conversations from those systems and put them into then smaller spaces where we can be a lot more nimble, a lot faster, and a lot more effective then.
Although the bricks end up as a bit of an echo chamber.
Hello. So, I think the majority of people, including me, might see these arguments, the situation, and we are like, I want to make a change. So I can start by consuming less meat, keep using public transport, shop secondhand. But the reality is that, for example, from 1990 to 2015, the top 1% contributed 15% of the global emissions, and the bottom 50% only contributed to 7%. So we can make these changes, but that 1% will keep flying private, will keep using golf courses that consume massive amounts of water. And for example, where I'm from Barcelona, when there is a drought, they apply restrictions to individual houses, but the hotels can still use as much water as they want, and the services that apply to the richest people usually don't get restrictions. So as individuals, we see this and we might get discouraged by the impact that we can have. So my question is, what do you think that we as individuals can do?
Very challenging. Suggests are valuable, everybody individually, less waste and electrification. But it's very, very hard.
It's one of those things, because as rich people become richer, as richer nations, they require more fossil fuels. They will, they keep requiring more. And so what does that mean for the rest of us? And this is why I said it's a political issue, that despite the sciences, the evidence, it comes down to the political will of states to really respond. And how do you do that for countries that need strong economies to be able to provide for their people? I think this is an opportunity for, a rethink of the environmental, I think, apparatus. How do we look at environmental policies, and how do we work with that to help inform how we transition justly as well? So there's so many competing interests. But at the end of the day, if there is no political will, then we're always going to continue to have this conversation, and it's a disproportionate harm, and it's always the people in the vulnerable category group basket continue to suffer more, and unless there's real political will and change.
Yeah, I don't think anyone will disagree with you in that it is hard, and what do you do realistically, right? And this is a question I feel like I've had people ask me all the time, what it is that we can do. And yes, sure, we can, take shorter showers, and somebody is, the number of planes that fly to a COP every year, it boggles the mind, right? I feel like the one answer that I give is vote, right? Because your daily action might not have that compounding of an effect, but voting in your country does have an effect. And for anyone who says that, oh, I'm not into politics and, this is not about me, it is about you. As Saloti rightly said, it is about the politics. It is all very political. So vote. I don't want to say who to vote for. Vote for who you think will make that change realistic, right? Put in some will and some money and some muscle behind it. And I know it's very disheartening. And so I'd like to give a nice story over here, so we don't end also on a disheartening note. Is that when the UN Charter was being written, the preamble which says human rights, there was a big debate at the UN at that time, and the sentence was actually going to read blah 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 blah. for all men's rights. And it was 3 women diplomats who fought the entire the system at that time and had that word man changed to human. And so that's why in the preamble of the charter, it says for all human rights, right? So small change is possible that then has a very positive cascading effect, 70 years later now. So I thought that it's a nice, I like to tell this story because it's usually a nicer way to end than sometimes when we have these very heavy climate change related discussions, they can get a little bit sad.
Okay, very good to be optimistic at the end. Thank you. That was a very fascinating and stimulating discussion, and thanks for your questions. I do want to note that we do have a session after this where you can talk to our speakers, and we're going to have canapes, I think, and we have an open bar as well. So please do stick around and talk to us and get to know us. In the meantime, I would like to thank once again the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany and Ambassador Beata Greski for her kind support for this event and in general. Also our South Australian branch led by Leonard Blaseby, and of course our speakers, Bika Vishwanath. I should have mentioned you're also the founding director of the Kubenine Initiative. Salote Tagawakatini, Jennifer Mackay, and of course Joanne Wallace. Thank you very much. And please, and canapes are to your right. So thank you very much.
And of course, Joanne's